What's going on, everybody? Welcome to today's video, reacting to You Don't Need a Guitar Amp by JensLarsen. So what's going on, everybody? Today we're going to be reacting to You Don't Need a Guitar Amp by JensLarsen. As always, please go and give JensLarsen's channel a sub and also give a like to this video, the original video. I've included it in the description. And on my video, this video, leave a comment on what you'd like to see me react to next. Now, I know this video is a little on the older side, but hey, it's right there in the vein of a huge topic of discussion and what I cover on this channel quite a bit, amp modeling and the discussion between real amps versus modelers, pros and cons, which ones you use, which ones you should be using, so on and so forth. So, without further ado, let's get on to it.
I stopped using real amps 12 years ago and I never looked back. It works really well and I am far from the only jazz guitarist to do so. For me, actually the biggest advantage to not using an amp is really not what I expected, but it turned out to make a huge difference and solve a problem that I've been trying to fix for years.
Well, the first thing I think people are going to notice when they watch you play tonight is there's no guitar amplifier up there.
Yeah, I'm using a direct box and I have been for the DI box for the last couple of years. And I just go through the house system, whatever the house is.
Joe got tired of bringing an amp and then decided to just use a DI. And I think you can sort of tell from his sound here, but he does sound really good in concert. For me, it was not about carrying the amp. This was in 1994, and to be honest, I wasn't that surprised that Joe didn't always use an amp. And his very...
In 94? But just straight DI tracks. I'm wondering if he had, like, any tone shaping at all going on, like, any stomp boxes? Like, I know there was no real amp modeling, so to speak, back then, but did he even have, like, an EQ pedal, a little bit of delay and reverb pedal going on or something like that? Or was it all just straight front of the house? Because that doesn't really sound like a straight DI track to me. If it is, it had front of house doing something to shape that tone, because just straight up DI tracks, I know, trust me, I record DI tracks for almost everything. For everything that I've recorded has been DI tracks and then has then later been reamped. I know what straight up flat raw DI tracks sound like. That did not sound like a straight up raw DI track to me.
Very clean tone is also easier to get without a guitar amp in my experience. I was a bit more surprised that John McLaughlin didn't use amps either.
It's more of a convenient thing, but I stopped using amps years ago. I mean, like really 20 years ago. The louder the volume is on stage, the harder job it is for the engineer up front to get a good sound.
This is always true.
At the end of my study at the conservatory, I was getting started playing gigs, both concerts and cafe gigs. Most jazz club gigs and cafe gigs are played with the backline of the band. So we just bring our amps and there's no PA needed since the place is not that big and the people...
Okay, you see, this is a way different world than I am used to. I'm not a jazz player. I never really have been. Total respect. Love what jazz players can do. Total respect. But what I'm used to doing always is playing, rock, blues, funk, all that sort of stuff, where you actually have a vocalist. So yes, there is a PA system, but almost the same idea is what they've got going on. That for the most part, that PA system is used primarily just for maybe a little bit of kick drum and vocals, because playing small pubs and restaurants, kind of like what it looks like they're playing. that looks like they're just shoved into a corner of a typical kind of pub or restaurant that I would play with my solo gig or something like that, or my 3 or 4 piece band from back in the day. And we'd be using what we would call sound on a stick, you know, essentially a couple 15s with horns on stands and a 800-watt powered mixer. And that's pretty much just for vocals and a little bit of kick drum, maybe a tiny little bit of bass guitar, you know, and it's mainly the amps filling up the room. So yeah, in a situation like that, I don't know if modelers would work all the time. It might if we had them playing an E-kit, because a rock drummer isn't going to play nice and quiet like a jazz drummer can do and does sometimes. Don't get me wrong. I know jazz drummers beat the hell out of their kits sometimes, but let's face it, they're not playing as loud as a rock drummer. So yeah, it always depends on the venue and the PA. That's what I always say.
Are not that loud. The advantage to this is that you get fairly good at dialing in your amp so that it A, works in the band, and B, sounds good in the room. And it does make you a bit flexible and used to react to the acoustics of the room. The thing to remember is that you dial in a tone with your ears, not with your eyes. At the time, I was playing my ES175 through either my Fender Twin amp or my Polytone, sometimes adding an LXP1 Lexicon reverb that I'd bought used on eBay. I was actually...
That guitar with that amp, just hearing that before hearing him say it. I know you said you dial in the tone with your ears, not your eyes, but come on. Those are both some serious pieces of gear. And I'm a guy that advocates, you know, using what I call these days inexpensive guitars, not cheap guitars. Yeah, I love my Harley Bentons and all those cheapos, but that's some nice gear. That's some nice gear.
Pretty happy with how this sounded. The situation where this fell apart was when someone had to get my sound into a PA, usually festivals and sometimes bigger jazz clubs. The problem is that I would have one sound coming out of my amp, which was a lot of mids and a lot of treble, but between my rig and the PA, there was a microphone, usually a Shure SM57. And a sound engineer that probably loved Toto or something else from the 80s, where the guitar sounds like the tone RJ is nailing here. And that's of course pretty far from how you want your ES175 to sound, and also not what you expect when what is coming out of your amp is this type of sound. Now, this was getting increasingly frustrating, but
in my opinion, both of them were fantastic tones, but I get totally what he's saying. I get it. I want this tone, and I'm getting this tone because the way the front of the house is mixing it. I get it, but both good tones, but they both have their place. And the tone that he was getting from the front of the house sound man, which was the one that RJ was demoing, yeah, that's not the tone for this for him.
Most of the time, we just played through our own backline where it didn't really matter. And while I was playing gigs, I was also developing my sound and my taste, which led to looking for another guitar and my first encounter with a modeler, which didn't really work out. While I was trying to figure out how I wanted to sound and how to get that sound, I realized that I wanted to try a semi-hollow guitar with humbuckers instead of the ES175. The idea was to have a more mid-focused tone, and the lack of sustain.
335 copy. Yeah, is it I can't quite see what the headstock says, but yeah, I love my 335 copy. And I did something that was quite sacrilegious that everybody says that is a horrible, horrible thing to do with a hollow body. I put EMGs in it, but it's also got a piezo bridge pickup as well too. It's an interesting guitar.
With the 175 felt very limiting sometimes for some of the things that I wanted to play. I also realized from listening to Kurt Rosenwinkel, Ben Monder and Pat Metheny that I wanted to explore using both delay and reverb together. two effects that I actually still consider a very important part of my sound. The delay pedal that I've seen many people use was the Line 6 DL4, this green box, and I already had the second-hand Lexicon reverb.
That is a legendary pedal. Yes, that is one that a lot of people really liked. And you know what? That is technically the pedal that I was really introduced to live looping on. Yes, that was the first time I actually saw somebody live doing multiple parts and looping them together as a solo performer. It was that old Line 6 unit. And a guitar player I played in a band with had one. And I told him, hey, you can do that. Like, hey, try this, try that. And he ran those loops. And then that's when I was hooked on looping. But I knew that that wasn't primarily a looper. It does a bunch of delays and all that stuff and can be used as a looper. But that's what made me want to go out instantly and buy, I think at the time it was the RC20, the first dual pedal looper. Yeah, that's what I started off with, an RC20. Yeah, but yes, great pedal, legendary pedal.
It was, however, sometimes an issue that the reverb was not that practical, and it felt like it could easily get damaged being a rack unit. I was right out of school, so I didn't have a lot of money, and when I noticed that I might be able to get a multi-effect like the Line 6 Pod XT for only €150 more than the delay, and the Pod XT had the Line 6 delay built into it, then that was certainly worth exploring. Essentially, I only needed to check if the reverb was okay. In general, the effects in the Pod XT were surprisingly good, and especially the reverb and the delay. Since it was also modular, then I did experiment a little bit with using the amp simulation in there, but when I used that live, it felt compressed and it didn't sound and feel anywhere nearly as good as my real amps. So
yeah, Line 6 didn't really get it right at all until the HX family. Sorry. Now, I always say this, like especially the original pods. Sorry. The amp models and overdrives in those, hot garbage. The reverbs and the delays and the other modulation effects were good and always were. Those effects were always good. But in the original, the red bean pod, no. I really don't even think, a lot of the stuff with, that unit, like he said, the HX, the Pod HD or whatever the hell. I've seen that unit. I can't exactly remember. But yeah, I remember hearing the amp models and that as well, too. Still not there yet. It's like anything else. It was a new technology. It took time. But guess what? Now, it's there.
So that was quickly turned off. In the meantime, I'd also bought a second-hand Epiphone Sheraton, so this guitar, and my rig at that point was the guitar into the Pod, into either the Twin or the Polytone, and mostly the Polytone because it was not as heavy or big as the Twin. But of course, with this setup, I was still having the problem of a random sound guy putting random mics in front of the amp and doing strange things with the EQ. And this was especially at the smaller jazz festivals, which I played really a lot of.
Here's the thing, though. Even when you're using a modeler, you're still sending front of house a signal. They can still do a whole bunch of things with the EQ and effects. They can add whatever effects they want to it, even though you're going to have it dial it in your way. That doesn't mean that front of house isn't going to do the front of house thing where they change it up any which way you want. I understand what you're saying. You want more control over it, but you can give front of house what you're going to give them. They're going to give front of house what they want to give to front of house.
Throw all sound engineers under the bus. Then let me just say that, of course, there are great guys out there, and I've worked with quite a few of them that are great both for live sound and recording albums. But this was just very often an issue, and I really wanted to get rid of it. And surprisingly, going to a better modular setup did exactly that 90% of the time, just not in the way that you would expect. After using the Pod XT together with the amps for some time, then I was looking for a way to update the rig. The Twin sounded great, but only if I could play loud, and it was 43 kilos, which is
heavy.
95 pounds, I was considering getting 2 smaller tube amps and try to build a pedal board, but I was again confronted with how expensive that would be. And then I had a few experiences with recording albums with the Twin that really changed things. When you're recording jazz music, it is essentially a live recording and always a bit nerve-wracking. I always found it stressful, but also very exciting. And when I showed up to the recording sessions, I often ended up working with recording engineers who wanted to decide how I set up my amp and also put a mic in front of my guitar and telling me to, under no circumstances, use any kind of effects. Now, this...
Okay, interesting. Like I said, jazz is not my world. Total respect. Badass musicians in jazz. Super, total badass. First off, I didn't know that for the most part, they're recording live off the floor. Impressive. Very, very impressive. You know, sometimes people will do that just to get that feel with the drummer going, but he'll still have a click on, and the only thing that's really being put to tape is the drums, and everybody will layer over top of it. But yeah, I don't necessarily think that it's not, you know, like the engineer said, did not want you to put any effects on your amp. Now, hopefully, they're getting a DI track as well, too, for the potential of reamping. Reamping is something that I always believe in. Recording, always get a DI track. It's just a backup. It's just like, you know, running a computer, you got a backup. But anyways, as long as you're getting a clean DI track first, then yeah, I guess you could throw some effects on your amp. But I understand them wanting to get the amp sound with no effects on it, so they can put those in post. And then, you know, reamping, if you decide that you have one of your reverbs or one of your delays or your pedals that you want that sound, okay, we can reamp with it or do that. Just maybe, you know, a nice compromise as take a DI track just so everybody can be happy.
Of course, resulted in me having to play on the recordings with a tone that I didn't like, and that was completely different from how I sounded live, which felt very strange, not only for me, but also for the rest of the band. Now, I might want something to sound close to something like this, or this. But when I listened to the recording, I always felt it sounded like this. Of course, a huge part of the problem was communication, and that I didn't know anything about EQing and compression, so I couldn't really explain what it was that I wanted. But I did take part in some mixing sessions where I spent a long time getting rid of the acoustic mic in front of my guitar and trying to get a better EQ and a type of compression that did not make my pick attack a lot louder, something that I just always really hated. After this series of recordings in 2010, it was clear to me that I needed to find a way to get more control of how I sounded on albums as well. And it felt like it would be nice to have a different process. Until then, I was just showing up and got a Shure SM57 placed in front of the amp.
But that's standard. 57 in front of the amp, that's standard. And again, like, I understand maybe where he's going, I think, but, you know, you're still sending a signal to the front of the house. They're still going to do with it what they will.
That was set up in a way I didn't like, usually also with that mic in front of my guitar, and that just didn't work. At the time, I had a student who had told me how he found the Pod XT horrible and disliked everything digital, except for maybe one thing: the fractal audio XFX. I'd never heard about fractal audio, so I started checking online.
That's where amp modeling started to turn around. It didn't start to turn around for line 6 until they got to the HX part of things. Yeah, into the Helix stuff. But yeah, once you get into fractal, that's when things started really, really, really becoming, oh, okay. Now we're there.
In what I could find, and there were quite a few YouTube videos on the XFX.
Hallo, mein Name ist Peter Autschbach.
Most of them on how to get a metal tone with a rectifier and a tube screamer, or how to sound like Pink Floyd. But But I also came across the forum and decided to go to an XFX meeting here in the Netherlands. The XFX was only available if you ordered it from Germany, so you couldn't go to a store to try one, and I also didn't know anybody who had one. The meeting was sort of an odd experience walking around among a lot of people who already had an XFX, but I did get to try one out and dial in a twin tone quickly with the help of one of the guys there that knew what he was doing, because I didn't. And I actually really liked the result. Even though an XFX was pretty expensive, I decided that this was definitely worth trying, and the investment was anyway cheaper than getting tube amps and good effect pedals. Now, needless to say, I really like the XFX, which is also why I'm now on the third generation of Fractal audio products. Both the effects and the amps in there sound really great, and it does everything that I needed to do, plus that I actually prefer the control of the sound and the volume when I play live. Now, I'm not going to get into how I set it up in this video, but maybe that's something for another video.
It is fairly expensive, though. That's my gripe with units like the Fractal and, you know, the Helix type stuff. It is quite pricey. Hey, if you got the money, go for it, but there are cheaper alternatives that are quite fantastic. Like I always say, my Valiton GP200 is absolutely fantastic. And, you know, these days, the digital modeling on the overall is fantastic. You don't need to go Fractal. You don't need to go XFX. You don't need to go Helix HX. You don't need to go Neural DSP Quad Cortex. Those are fantastic units, don't get me wrong, but not even just my Valiton GP200. The stuff that Moore is doing, the stuff that, you know, the Ampero, the Hot Tone stuff, there is some really affordable stuff. The Newix stuff, you know, there's some great stuff out there.
I've already talked about how the problem with my setup with the amp was not the gear, it was what happened afterwards. And in a way, it shouldn't really change when I went to the Fractal stuff. But what I found when playing live in pretty much all situations is that if you give a sound engineer XLR cables, instead of having them set up a mic in front of an amp like they usually do, then that is enough of a pattern interrupt so that they don't just do whatever they usually do and instead listen to what is there and think about how it sounds. To be honest, I did not expect it to solve the problem, but it...
You see, that's the thing that surprises me that I was saying earlier. I don't think necessarily that giving them just an XLR, you know, output, you know, as opposed to a mic'd up amp would cause them to, you know, basically hands off on the signal more. I know that's the way it should be, and essentially what guitar players and bass players that use amp modeling are doing or trying to do is essentially take away almost every bit of option from the sound man, saying, here you go. Here's the XLR. You can go out of the XLR out of my modeler. I've got my amps dialed in. I've got my effects. I've got everything. All you have to do is play with faders to have the rest of the band dial in. I know essentially, but I still think a lot of sound men would still like to meddle with your tone and still like to mix it whichever way they want. I still think so. But apparently, according to him, not so much.
It really did, and doing recordings were similar, though there sometimes I'm still getting discussions and get asked to record through whatever amp they have in the studio. For me, the biggest difference when I'm recording is that I can record with a sound that feels like my sound and not an electrified, dry recording of a banjo. If you're familiar with my guitar sound, then you probably know it from YouTube, and I'd already stopped using amps when I started making YouTube videos.
Today I wanted to make a lesson about...
But for this, the Fractal was absolutely perfect. It's incredibly easy to record at home, and I even did the first few years without having an audio interface, just using the line-in on my PC. Lately, I've had fun messing around with delay and reverb plugins, trying to learn some tricks from Warren Hewart over at Produce Like a Pro, and that has meant that I'm often now recording some of the solo guitar things that I post without any reverb and delay, because I like to have the freedom to mess around later, which is of course also why I was told to turn off effects in the studio. But that has now become sort of a sonic playground for me, messing around with a few of my favorite delay and reverb plugins, and just something I have fun doing. For me, it's pretty clear that I can get the sound that I want using a modeler. I doubt if it's really about the brand of that modeler.
Yep, the
and
Kemper
it's also
too.
easy to see that there are far more advantages than disadvantages to using one. But that doesn't mean that I don't like amps. You need to find the solution that works for you. And I still have my Twin and my Polytone, even if I don't use them very often. It's also...
Yes, and I've recently got my first all-tube guitar amp as well too. I got the Monoprice 15 watt, 12 inch that has the Celestion 7080 in it. All tube, 3 power tubes, 2 preamp tubes, and actually built an analog pedal board out of mini pedals and a Forta board to go along with it. There's going to be videos on all of that coming up on this channel soon. So yes, I still love and use real amps whenever there's a place for them. Like I said, whenever I would be playing any sort of band situation out with, in my local area, we're playing smaller to medium bars, pubs, and clubs. You need to bring an amp and a small PA. So for that, tube amps, absolutely. For all the live streaming that I'm doing here in this little tiny studio, I'm just going out of my RC600, which also works as an interface, directly into my computer and using in-ear monitors. If I had actual amps, I wouldn't be able to hear anything from the loops off my in-ears. I would think that the actual tube amps in the room would be far too loud. For that solution, my Valiton GP200 for my guitar, my Zoom B14 for my bass, with amp models and effects and everything dialed in, works perfectly. The guitars and basses are processed in their modelers / effects units and that are sent right over to the loop station. It works perfectly that way. All depends on the situation once again.
About finding things that inspire you and that are fun to mess around with. Let me know what you think and what you use in the comments. What tone you like and what you need from an amp or an instrument changes over time, and it's good to also enjoy that journey and hopefully not waste too much money along the way. With guitars, you can approach this in sort of a stepwise manner without immediately getting a very expensive instrument, but still end up with a very solid guitar. If you want to hear about how I replaced my vintage ES-175 with a $400 semi-hollow, then check out this video.
All right. So there we have it. You Don't Need a Guitar Amp by JensLarsen. So again, go and give JensLarsen a sub. Go to the original video. I put a link in the description, and give the original video a like. And don't forget to leave a comment on this video, my video, on what you'd like to see me react to next. Thanks for checking out this video. If you like what you saw, please subscribe, click the notification bell, like, comment, and share. It doesn't cost a thing and would really help out the channel. Also, please subscribe to my other channel, GK Mac Music, for some live looping live streams with a side of jackassery, some original music, and some short content, also with a side of jackassery. If you'd like to help out the channel financially, you can buy some merch at the merch store, or you can become a channel member. As always, everyone, thanks so much for your continued support. Do what makes you happy.